content of the presentation is going to be the following. I'm going to first talk about the outlook and the social impact that this crisis had, the drivers of the short-term outlook, and the risks to this outlook. So first of all, and this is the good news, the half full glass, Latin America recovered faster than everyone expected. Most analysts actually expected that the region would have a very protracted recovery, and that was not the case. Last year, actually, most economies rebounded to levels that allowed them to recover the GDP levels that they had prior to the crisis. However, for this year, we're expecting a slowdown in growth rates. Again, with the half full glass, this recovery, as opposed to what we witnessed in previous crises, will allow Latin American countries to recover the trend that they had previous to the crisis. This is unlike the typical Latin American crisis that was due to macroeconomic imbalances, and the region actually never reached the GDP levels nor the trend that they had previous to the crisis, and that is exactly what happened with the end of the commodity super cycles in 2015 that we see in this graph to the right. So this is good news for the region. What is not so great news is that not all countries are in this situation. Some countries actually will have a more protracted recovery, and that is due especially to the more protracted recovery in services, and part of this is due to tourism. We actually see that Barbados and Mexico will be affected by this crisis more than other countries, the Andean countries or Brazil in the case of South America. And the other half-empty glass actually stems from the fact that the growth rate, the potential growth rate that the region is returning to is rather slow. And after 2015, the region stopped reducing poverty levels and stopped reducing inequality, and the growth of the middle class is sort of stagnated. So reverting to those slow trends will make it difficult to revert the social costs of the crisis in terms of the increase in poverty rates, and also the labor market has not recovered. Part of the gains in employment that we see today are in low-wage employments and informal employments, and that could have potentially efficiency losses in the long term, and the longer workers remain inactive, which is the case of women in the region, which is something that you can see in this chart, because female participation reduced because women had to take care of the children. The longer that situation persists, the less likely these workers will be able to place themselves in a formal job with a higher wage. So this is something that could have longer-term effects in the region in terms of growth. So what are the drivers of this outlook of a somewhat end of that fast growth rate that we saw last year? Well, the first is that as in the rest of the world, we'll see external conditions to somewhat normalize. We see that international trade levels will become more closer to the averages as opposed to the spike that we saw last year with the recovery. And also remittances that were crucial to support consumption levels in Mexico and Central America in particular will revert to more normal levels as well. Also, financial conditions will keep tightening. The United States is assuming the Fed actually has a more aggressive position regarding the increase in interest rates. So that will change the financial conditions for the region. The region is still able to issue debt at competitive costs at this point, but that will slowly change over the coming years. And also the region last year, FDI did not recover totally compared to pre-pandemic levels, but certainly there was a recovery. But in general terms, the financial conditions will be tighter than they were before the crisis. Then the momentum of the recovery, the gains from in terms of growth rates of reopening economies from zero to resuming activity will be lost just by a statistical factor. We're going to be comparing more normal levels of activity with higher levels of activities as opposed to just comparing activity from zero levels. So that will have an implication on growth rates. And finally, something that is weighing on industrial production, particularly in Mexico and Brazil, that are the most industrialized countries in Latin America, the bottlenecks that we're seeing in global value chains, especially with the scarcity that we're seeing in semiconductors that is affecting the auto industry, it's having an effect, and it's slowing down growth in Mexico and Brazil. So that will also weigh on growth. And finally, we're seeing that Latin American countries are reducing the stimulus, the fiscal and monetary stimulus that we had. With the crisis, and this, we go back to the half-empty glass, most governments in the region were able to implement large support packages for families and firms to keep them alive. And in 2020 and in 2021, part of that stimulus was reverted as activity recovered. And mainly what we see in this chart to the right is that improvement in the fiscal results was due to the reversal of spending, of those transfers that were issued to the families and the firms, even to a larger extent than the recovery in taxes due to the larger levels of activities in the region. So a more normal global situation, tighter global financial conditions, statistical effects, and the withdrawal of previous stimulus will determine this lower growth rates that we're going to see in the region this year. So what are the risks to this outlook? And I'm going to start with what we all know, new waves of the pandemic. But in the case of Latin America, this risk is mitigated by large vaccination rates in the population. And this was another positive surprise in the region. Authorities were able in most countries to roll vaccination campaigns that were actually very successful, and a large chunk of countries in Latin America, although there are large differences across countries, were able to vaccinate the population even to a larger fraction than in developed economies. Moreover, even with Omicron, the activity levels did not stop as they did during the first waves of the pandemic, because there was more adaptation to working with the pandemic, and because of the larger vaccination levels, the pandemic did not cause a collapse in the health systems. So this risk is mitigated. But there's another risk that we all know about, the Ukraine conflict. We don't know how the conflict will unravel. We don't know the long-term consequences on the global economy because we don't know how this is going to end. But in the short term, there are clear economic implications of this conflict. And the first of them, and the way Latin American economies are going to be affected, is through commodity prices. Why? Because there's a disruption in two large markets, the foodstuffs market and the oil market. This is because Russia is the largest exporter of natural gas, with 25% of all exports of natural gas, mainly to Europe, and the second largest exporter in the world of crude oil. So of course, if there's a disruption in the supply of these commodities, there's going to be an increase in prices, which is what we're seeing right now. And also, Russia and Ukraine are large exporters in grains and fertilizers, so that is also affecting the prices of grains and fertilizers. And moreover, this could have second round effects on the whole agriculture industry, because that industry consumes a lot of fuel and a lot of fertilizers, so foodstuffs across the board we're going to see price increases in this case. This is going to affect the region in different ways. Net oil importers in the region will see their current accounts widen, while net energy importers in the region, exporters in the region, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, Bolivia, and Trinidad, will see their current accounts improve. So for these countries, they're going to have more disposable income to spend, and it's going to be the opposite for the rest of the countries. And the more affected countries are going to be the ones with wider current account deficits in the Caribbean and in Central America. Then these countries could find it more difficult to finance their current account deficits, because there's a risk of mood in financial markets, and the appetite for financing or for purchasing risk assets is lower, and that is reflected in higher sovereign risk spreads across the region, although not to the extent that it changed in Eastern Europe. However, the region is at this point more able to withstand that shock, because international reserves are larger than they were compared to previous shocks. Current account deficits are narrower, and also currencies in most countries are depreciated, so there's not a large imbalance in terms of the currency markets in these countries. So yes, we're going to see a negative effect for net energy importers in the region, but there are some mitigants that will not possibly turn that into a major crisis. But the other risk is increase in prices, and this is kind of like adding insult to injury, because inflation rates were already high in the region, were already above the targets of the central banks, and central banks actually had started to increase interest rates early since last year across the board in Latin American countries, particularly those with inflation targets. And the increase in energy and in foodstuffs has a higher weight on CPIs in Latin American countries compared to advanced economies. So this will obviously have an impact, a further impact on prices, and this could accelerate the cycle of interest rate increases in Latin America. Then, just for reasons of time, I'm going to go straight to this. One of the risks to the recovery is a more structural problem in Latin America, which is low productivity. In this chart here, we see that total factor productivity compared to the United States has remained stagnant in the region over the past few decades. Of course, there are large differences across countries, and this has to do to a large extent. This is something across the board in all economic sectors in the region, but to a large extent, and these are just two examples, Ecuador and Peru, this has to do with the importance of the informal sector in Latin America, which is quite large. And these firms tend to be small, do not have proper access to capital markets, and cannot employ or do not invest that much in technology, particularly in the agricultural sector in many countries where it is mostly subsistence agriculture. Even in the case of Peru, where you had that major increase in foodstuffs exports, you see that 90% of the people employed in agriculture are informal. So this is something that the region has to further work on with structural and resume the structural reforms to address this problem. And finally, we have that the region is not in a great fiscal position at this point. Like in every other country in the world, we had a major increase in debt levels after the crisis, and even if deficits reduced last year and be contained